Right now, as you're watching this, something just happened in the Persian Gulf that every American needs to understand, because it doesn't just affect a tiny island 15 miles off the Iranian coast. It affects the price of gas in your tank, the food on your table, and the balance of power between the two most dominant nations on Earth. Last night, at Trump's direct order, U.S. Central Command executed what the president himself called one of the most powerful bombing raids in the history of the Middle East, obliterating every military target on Kharg Island, Iran's crown jewel. And here's what you need to know before you hear a single pundit spin this. That tiny coral island is the backbone of Iran's entire oil economy, a nation that earned $53 billion in net oil export revenues last year alone. But Trump didn't touch the oil infrastructure. Not yet. He left it standing, deliberately, as a loaded gun pointed at Tehran's economy. He told the world plainly, the moment Iran interferes with free passage through the Strait of Hormuz, he will immediately reconsider. Now here's where it gets complicated. Here's where it stops being just an American story. The majority of the oil flowing out of Kharg Island doesn't go to Europe. It doesn't go to the United States. It goes to China, accounting for nearly 12% of China's entire seaborne oil imports this year. China is Tehran's biggest customer, its financial lifeline, the reason sanctions never fully strangled the Iranian regime. And now the U.S. military is standing at the doorstep of that lifeline with a lit match in its hand. Tehran is already signaling it might allow some vessels through the strait, but only if cargo is traded in Chinese yuan. That's not a coincidence. That's Beijing and Tehran drawing a line together, in real time, against the dollar-dominated world order. Brent crude closed above $103 a barrel on Friday. Gas prices across America have already surged 23% since this war began on February 28th. And that number is going higher. Every economist watching this conflict agrees, if Kharg Island's oil infrastructure falls, you remove 2 million barrels per day from global supply. Permanently. One analyst put it bluntly, seizing Kharg would cut off Iran's oil lifeline and give Washington leverage over whatever regime emerges after the guns go quiet. So the real question isn't whether Trump will strike the oil. The real question is, what does China do when it's forced to choose between watching its energy supply get destroyed and entering a conflict it has spent decades trying to avoid? China has already condemned the U.S.-Israeli strikes as a violation of international law and said it is deeply concerned about the regional spillover. That's diplomatic language. What it really means is, Beijing is watching its economic security evaporate in real time, and it hasn't yet decided how far it's willing to go to protect it. This is the story. Not just a war in Iran. It's a collision between American military power and Chinese economic survival, fought over a 5-mile island in the Persian Gulf that most Americans have never heard of. Until now. Now, I want you to stay with me here, because what I'm about to walk you through is not a headline you can scroll past and forget. This is one of those moments in geopolitics where the pieces on the board are moving so fast, and the consequences are so enormous that most people don't even realize what game is actually being played. And the game right now, the real game, is about Kharg Island. A small strip of land sitting in the Persian Gulf that most people in the world have never heard of, and yet, without it, the global economy as we know it would crack at its foundations within weeks. So let me paint the picture for you properly. Kharg Island is not just an oil terminal. It is the beating heart of Iran's entire petroleum export infrastructure. Roughly 90% of all the oil Iran sells to the outside world flows through that one island. Think about that for a second. All those tankers, all those billions of dollars in revenue that keep the Iranian government functional, that fund its proxies across the Middle East, that sustain its nuclear ambitions, it all bottlenecks through one geographic choke point in the Persian Gulf. And Washington knows this. Washington has always known this. But what has changed in recent months is the tone. The quiet, clinical conversations happening inside think tanks and certain corridors of the Pentagon are no longer quite so quiet anymore. What we're seeing now is an escalation in the language of American strategic pressure. And language in geopolitics is never accidental. when senior officials and advisors connected to the administration begin floating the idea of targeting Iran's oil export capacity, not just sanctioning it, not just economically squeezing it, but physically neutralizing it, you have to understand that this represents a categorical shift in how Washington is thinking about its Iran problem. Because for decades, the American approach to Iran has lived somewhere between containment and coercion. Sanctions, diplomatic isolation, proxy pressure, support for regional adversaries. But striking Kharg Island? That's not containment. That's decapitation of Iran's economic lifeline. And every serious analyst in this space understands that such a move would not happen in a vacuum. And here is where China enters the equation. And this is the part of the story that I think most Western commentary gets fundamentally wrong. People talk about China as if it is some distant, reluctant bystander in the Middle East, a country too focused on its own domestic pressures and its trade war with the United States to want to involve itself in a hot conflict thousands of miles away. But that framing misses something critical. China is not a bystander in the Persian Gulf. China is the single largest buyer of Iranian crude oil on the planet. Not one of the largest, the largest. Iran has been selling discounted oil to China throughout the entire sanctions regime, and China has been absorbing it, refining it, using it to power its industrial machine. The relationship between Beijing and Tehran is not ideological solidarity. It is not a friendship in any meaningful sense. It is something far more durable and far more dangerous. It is structural economic dependency. So when you start talking about destroying the infrastructure through which that oil flows, you are no longer just talking about a conflict between the United States and Iran. You are talking about a direct material threat to China's energy security. And China does not take threats to its energy security lightly. This is a country that has spent the last 2 decades painstakingly constructing alternative supply chains, deepening relationships with Gulf producers, building the infrastructure for a world in which it is never again vulnerable to American pressure at a critical choke point. And now that choke point is being discussed openly as a military target. Let me slow down here because I want you to really absorb what the Chinese calculus looks like from Beijing's perspective right now. You have an American administration that has already demonstrated it is willing to use economic warfare as a blunt instrument. You have ongoing friction in the South China Sea. You have Taiwan as a permanent pressure point. And now you have the potential for American military action that would directly sever one of the arteries supplying Chinese industry with the energy it needs to function. If you are sitting in Zhongnanhai looking at all of this, you are not asking whether this affects China. You are asking how China responds without triggering a wider confrontation that it is not yet fully prepared to win. And that is the real tension at the center of this story. Because China's options here are genuinely difficult. On one hand, Beijing could choose to do nothing to absorb the disruption, accelerate its diversification away from Iranian oil, and avoid a direct confrontation with Washington. That is the pragmatic choice. That is the choice that keeps the broader bilateral relationship from completely collapsing. But it is also the choice that signals to every country in the world that is currently hedging between the American order and the Chinese alternative that Beijing will not protect you when it counts. And that signal has consequences that extend far beyond the Persian Gulf. On the other hand, if China moves toward any kind of active support for Iran in the event of American strikes, whether that means diplomatic cover at the United Nations, accelerated weapons transfers, naval posturing in the Gulf, or any form of material assistance to Iran's defensive capacity, then you have entered a phase of superpower confrontation that nobody in the international system is prepared for. Not the markets. Not the institutions, not the regional actors who have spent years carefully managing their relationships with both Washington and Beijing simultaneously. What makes this moment so genuinely precarious is that neither side has a clean exit. The United States, if it is seriously contemplating action against Kharg Island, has presumably war-gamed the Iranian response. The missile salvos, the Strait of Hormuz closure scenarios, the Hezbollah activation, the attacks on American bases in the region. These are all known quantities, terrible as they are. What is much harder to wargame is China's second and third order responses over weeks and months. The quiet ways in which Beijing could make American strategic objectives significantly more costly without ever firing a shot directly. And Iran understands this. Tehran understands that its greatest strategic asset right now is not its missile arsenal or its network of proxies, as formidable as those are. Its greatest strategic asset is its position as the node that connects Chinese energy dependency to American military ambition. As long as China needs Iranian oil and the United States wants to stop that oil from flowing, Iran exists in a strange kind of protected space, not safe, not comfortable, but structurally relevant in a way that makes the cost of destroying it very high. Now I want to be honest with you about something, because I think honesty is what separates serious analysis from the noise. We do not know if the United States will strike Kharg Island. What we know is that the conversation has shifted. What we know is that the window between strategic signaling and strategic action is narrower than it has been at any point in the last 2 decades of American-Iranian confrontation. And what we know, because history has shown us this again and again, is that when great powers begin openly discussing options that were previously considered too escalatory, the probability of those options being exercised rises, not because anyone wants catastrophe, but because momentum in geopolitics has a gravity of its own. The Persian Gulf has always been the place where American power and the aspirations of rising powers collide most visibly. And right now, with Kharg Island in the crosshairs of an American strategic conversation and China's industrial economy on the other end of those oil pipelines, we are watching that collision move from slow motion into something considerably faster. Whether the world's institutions, its leaders, and its markets are ready for what comes next is a question none of us can answer with certainty. But we should all be paying attention, because what happens in that small island in the Persian Gulf will not stay in the Persian Gulf.